So this is a work in progress. It's called The Cult of Evan Summer. Evan's a printmaker, a world-class printmaker who teaches at Kutztown University in the College of Visual and Performing Arts, as do I. And so this is done in processing. Processing is it's a programming language created by Ben Fry and Casey Rees, specifically for artists, musicians, designers, creative people in general. So it has a lot of things that let us do things with color and sound, etc. It's still a programming language, so you type code to do things. And this is not a really complicated project, but it's also not a simple project. So you can see I've actually got a bunch of files, related files here that do various things, which I give them quasi-descriptive names. This one makes some kind of house shape. This makes like an arched doorway. This makes these, I'm calling ribs and walls and washes, etc. There's a fade to black. So each one of these little things, chunks of code, since this is in Java, these are called classes, and each one knows how to do some specific little thing. Draw a particular kind of shape. These may have variables, so they can be different colors and sizes, and since it moves through time, they could go at different speeds, etc. So then the main file links it all together. So we start out by creating some variables, then we create all the things that we will need to use throughout it. So I've got some color definitions and some fonts and things. And then I start making the shapes, at least in sort of computer memory terms, so they're stored. And you see there's a lot of randoms in here, which means that they will be positioned randomly in different locations. And then I've got a pick color function that randomly picks a color from some predefined colors I've created, and also just random colors in general. And then we have a title sequence, and then I actually start loading in these various visual objects, drawing them to the screen, which is what all this stuff does in this draw function, which is a thing that processing uses. It creates a drawing loop, which basically draws the screen at some number of times per second. The default is 60 frames per second. We can speed that up or slow it down, but and then we've got an end screen, and then it starts all over again. So let's run it and see what happens. So that's the title sequence. It starts out. The idea here was to kind of make it look like a black plate where it's a lacquer coating on copper, and we scratch into it to create an etching. We see the copper through the black lacquer because we've scraped it off. And then it starts generating these kind of Evanesque shapes. So we've got two different kind of house shapes. One is like a flat filled shape. The other is made with lines, much like you would do with an etching. And so we've got some arches being generated. We've got these things I call ribs, and there's some kind of archway down at the bottom. So various shapes. Some blobs are showing up because it's something that shows up in many of Evan's prints. So the idea was kind of take his visual vocabulary and generate it with code. So the colors and shapes are partly programmed, so they repeat the arches. You can see they may change scale and color. There's a row of them, different things. Same thing with the houses, these other shapes, and the blobs show up here and there. But it's never going to look the same twice. The placement's going to change, the colors are going to change. And here we have like a wash. So this is also something you get in the process of etching, where you end up with kind of, it depends on how you do your printing. You may get areas of kind of grays and or colors, depending on your ink color, of course. but with black ink you would pick grays. And so that's what it does. So it just keeps going. Sometimes it makes a really pleasing composition. Other times it makes like a really kind of not very pleasing composition. And again, there's no, in the code itself, there's no aesthetic being determined. The computer certainly doesn't know what's a good image and what's a bad image. That might be an interesting thing to try and teach it at some point. There's a big thing now called machine learning, where maybe I could watch it, other people could watch it, and we could say, oh, I like that, and hit a button, and the computer would remember that we like that. So it doesn't know how to make those judgments, but maybe it could be taught to. So it goes to the end screen. I did a beginning and an end only because I think it helps people, viewers, to put it in some kind of context, that it's going to go through this process, it's going to make this image, it's going to take some time, but if it just goes on forever, then how do you decide when to walk away? So I don't know, the idea of having it kind of cycle through, it doesn't do the same thing again, but it does something kind of similar, but the idea of an end kind of gives the viewer an excuse to say, okay, I've seen that. Oh, maybe I want to watch it again, maybe I don't, or I'll come back later and see what it's up to. So depending on the complexity of the piece and what it's doing, I think to me it kind of helps give a little structure to it. So it's kind of like a song, and every time the band plays a song, maybe they don't play it exactly the same. Some bands do, some bands don't. So that was the idea. So I'm going to escape out of that, and we're back to the code. So there it is. I'll stop that, and I will stop my recording.